Hi everybody, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another design team project for Trinity Stamps. Today we're going to be using a whole bunch of products here. We're going to be using the Nutty Squirrel stamp set, Forest Friends, and Sleepy Hollow. I'm also using the Autumn Sentiments that I didn't show you. For the stencils, I'm using the Autumn Tree and the Layered Birch. These are both layering stencils. So I'm starting off with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and I have all of my images lined up. These are going to be die cut, so I'm just leaving enough space in between each one of these images so that I have room to put the dies down and tape them down so they don't move around in my Gemini. I am stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink, and I did stamp these twice just to make sure I got a really good impression each and every time. So we're going to move right into the coloring here, and I'm going to speed this portion up just a little bit because it took me a bit of time. So I want the inside of this little, I don't know what you call it, not really a cave, but I guess, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. But the inside, I want it to be a little bit darker because it's going to be kind of caved in a little bit. So the E59 is the darkest brown that I have. So I'm going in with my C7, which is a very, very dark gray. And I'm doing most of my shading in the very darkest areas with that. And then I'll blend out with the E59 just to make the center portion even darker than the rest of this image. I'm paying attention to the lines that are within the illustration because this will kind of guide me as far as where some additional shading should be. There's obviously some shape and some ridges and crevices within this image. So you want to make sure that when you're doing your coloring, you're paying attention to those, sometimes even creating your own just to add a little bit of texture. So I blended that out with the E57, and that will be my lightest color for that particular portion of the image. So next I'm going to move on to the outer portion here, and this, my darkest color, will be the E59. So I'm skipping the C7 here. I'm going right in with my darkest color because I want to keep that contrast that I'm getting within these little crevices or whatever you want to call them. I'm also adding a few more details or a few more areas of texture where these little branches and things that are kind of hanging out. I'm creating little V marks here, and this will just add a little bit of texture to it and give it a little bit more shape. Again, paying attention to those lines in the illustration, and you just want to make sure that you're shading in the same direction each and every time. It really doesn't matter which direction of that line you go on, but you'll just want to make sure that each time you kind of spread that out or blend that out, you're going in that same direction. I did the same thing with the E57, and all I really did was extend those areas out a little bit further. Same thing for the E55, and you can see that I'm leaving a highlight here, but I'm leaving pretty small highlight. The E53 is a fairly light color. It's more of like a tan or beige-ish color, and I don't want the image to be too light. So I'm leaving very small areas for that highlight color. So bringing in that E53, and I'm just spreading this color around, blending this out. You can see that I'm not being overly careful staying in the lines because it took me a while to color this particular image. So I'll fix up those coloring errors later. So I wanted to add a little bit of shading to the base of this because this would be what would be on the ground, so it would be a little bit darker. So I'm just adding a little bit of shading with that E57 and the E55. So I'm pretty much doing the same thing for this tree stub. What is it called? Stump, maybe? Again, should be Googling this. So I'm just adding a little bit of shading, paying attention to those lines, but I'm also adding a little bit of shading to either side of it because this would be a more rounder object. So I want to make sure that I am keeping a center highlight while still adding that texture, paying attention to those lines within that illustration. But using the same color combination, just skipping that C7. So next we'll move on to the deer, and I'm going to bring in some E30 markers, starting off with what was going to be my lightest color, which is that E31, and just mapping out my very darkest areas, which will be a little bit on either side of his face or her face, and a little bit coming up from where her nose is. Also paying attention to where one leg is laying behind another and where her little hind leg there, I guess, I don't know what it would be, maybe her hip, maybe? I don't know. That would also create a shadow on her body. So going in with the darkest color, that E37, and I'm using this very sparingly. You can see that my marker is pretty much straight up and down because I'm trying to get into these teeny tiny areas with just the tip of my marker, and I don't want to oversaturate the paper. As soon as your marker hits the paper, it may not be visible to the eye, but your ink will spread just a little teeny tiny bit. So you want to make sure that when you're getting in those little tiny areas, you are just using the tip of your marker. Hold that marker straight up and down. So I'm blending this out a little bit with the E35, then the E33, and once I got back to that E31, I realized I just didn't have a big enough highlight like I normally like. I really like to see that contrast. So if you've already added your scary dark color, which I did here, and you're still not getting the contrast, try to add a little bit of a scary light color. So in this case, I'm going to bring in the E30, which is really, really light, but this will allow me to get that contrast that I was kind of missing with that scary dark color, that E37. So for the inside of her ears and on either side of her face, her little chest and her tail, I want this to appear white. So I'm going to bring in some C markers here. And here, the scary dark here is the C5, which is obviously gray. So I'm using this very, very sparingly. I'm going to flick that out just a little bit with the C3 and the C1. And I am leaving white space on each one of these little areas of the image. I just want to add the shading. I still want these areas of this image to appear white. So you do want to leave some white space here. For her little feet or her hooves, I am just going to be using two different colors here. Not really too concerned about doing too much shading here because this is such a teeny tiny area. So I did only use two colors here, going directly in with my darkest color first. So for the pumpkins, I'm just going to show you one of these. I know that I've been coloring a lot of pumpkins lately, so you pretty much know how I'm doing my shading if you've ever seen any of my videos before. But this time I'm using a little bit different of a color combination. So just because you're watching videos and you see a certain color combination that people are using for a certain object, like a pumpkin that we all probably have colored a million times this time of year, doesn't mean you have to use that specific color combination. Take a look at what you have and see what you can use for that scary dark color. In this case, I used an E marker, and I'm using two orange and a yellow for my highlight. So just take a look in your stash to see what you have and just kind of experiment. So I colored the other two pumpkins the same exact way. And for the stems, I think they're called, of these pumpkins, I'm just using two different colors, going directly in with that darkest color first, being this area is so tiny. For the little wagon, for the middle portion, I am going to be using some E20 markers. Again, starting off with my lightest color to get that paper saturated. Going in with that E29, which is that scary dark color, just a little bit on either side. I'm not too concerned with the light source. Typically, when I'm die cutting my images and not doing a one-layer scene, I don't really care about a light source. I just keep a center light source for everything, being I'm really not sure at this point how I'm going to be arranging these on the card. So for the top and bottom portion, as well as the inside of the wheels, I am using the E18 as my darkest, spreading that out or blending that out with the E15, E11, and then the E01. For the inside of the wheels, I'm basically just putting a little bit of shading wherever my darkest area on the wagon itself is not, so that they don't blend in with one another, and you can kind of differentiate between the wheels and the wagon itself. I'm going to be using the same color combination here for this little squirrel. I know that there's a lot of brown squirrels in many places of the country and the world, but we only have gray squirrels. So somebody corrected me in a previous video. So for this squirrel, I am coloring him brown. Using that E18 as my darkest color, I'm just shading a little bit on the inside of his tail where his tail's kind of curled up and off to the left-hand side of his body because he is facing the right. Also putting a little bit of a shadow underneath where his scarf is hanging over his body and on that one foot that's kind of hanging behind the other, and then just using that E01 as my lightest color. For his little scarf, I wanted to bring back in the same color combination that I used for the pumpkins. Now this is a teeny tiny area. You don't necessarily have to use 4 colors here, but I figured they're already on my desk, so I'm going to use them. But for teeny tiny areas, I would definitely recommend going directly in with your darkest color, and this will prevent the paper from being oversaturated and you don't risk it bleeding outside of the image. For the little acorn that he's holding, I'm bringing back in the E20 markers and just doing a little bit of shading on either side because this would be more of a rounder object. I just realized I picked up the E29 instead of the E59, but oh well, it worked. So once my coloring was done, we are going to move on to the background, and this is going to be a long card. So I'm going to just start off by putting a base layer of all of the colors that I plan on using in the background. So these are all Distress Oxides, and I am working with some Blending Buddy brushes, also by Trinity Stamps. Starting off with the peeled paint on the top, spreading that out with the Bundled Sage, Fossilized Amber, Wild Honey, and Carved Pumpkin on the top. I'm not really at this point concerned about getting a perfect blend. I just want to put my color down, and then I'll worry about blending the colors together. You can see I dropped my ink pad on the floor there where Frankie was just sitting, so it's full of cat hair now. So whoever receives this card may receive a Frankie hair along with it. So I also had a question about what makes these brushes different than all of the brushes out there, or different than the makeup brushes that you can purchase pretty cheap at the dollar store or Walmart or at Amazon. These are obviously made for ink blending. To me, I don't have any of the makeup brushes, but my mother does. So I have tried hers. I find that these are a little bit more stable than the makeup brushes. They also stand up straight. So on your work surface, if you want to stand these up in front of you, they have a flat bottom. Also, when you clean them, it's really nice to just kind of stand them up while they dry. These also have a cap that will protect your bristles when you're storing them however you plan on storing them. So that's what makes these a little bit different. They do have the brown bristles as well as the white bristles. So here I'm just working in the opposite direction here, just making sure that my colors are blended with whatever color is directly next to it. You will want to make sure that you're using Distress Oxides for the next step because they are a little bit more opaque. If you use any regular dye ink or even traditional distress inks, you will not get the same result as we will get here because they are opaque. So I'm bringing out the Autumn Tree stencil here, and I'm just going to kind of move this around my card panel. Obviously, this is a long card, and this stencil is not necessarily made for that. Most stencils are not, but I'm going to move it around to make it work the way I want it to. So I'm using the Vintage Photo Distress Oxide, and I'm kind of just moving in the direction of the branches themselves so that my brush doesn't get stuck under those little intricate pieces. I'm putting one off to the left hand side, and then I'm just going to move my stencil and line up this other tree on the other side. However, I did not mask the other tree, and as you can see, they're pretty close together. So my brush did go over that one little branch there and in that other tree. So when I remove my stencil, there's kind of like a missing, or kind of like a random branch just sitting there. So I'm going to take the layered birch stencils, and I only really need one of these, and I'm kind of playing around to see which one will work with this little branch that's kind of just there. So what I decided to do is line this stencil up so that that just looks like another branch coming off this tree. Going to use my Post-it note tape to mask off the rest of these, I learned the first time, and use that same Vintage Photo to do some ink blending for these trees as well. You just want to kind of slowly layer up your ink. You don't want to add too much ink at once. Again, your brush can easily kind of slip under those intricate areas, so you want to try to avoid that. So next, bringing back in the Autumn Tree, and this is the second stencil in the set, and these are basically just falling leaves. So I'm bringing in some Candied Apple Distress ink, and another great thing about these brushes that I forgot to mention is the shape of them. So they're more of like a triangle where they come to more of a point. So you can use them for large areas and little teeny tiny areas like these leaves. So I'm just dropping in a little bit of that candied apple, but not completely covering the entire leaf. Bringing in the carved pumpkin and just blending those areas out so that I have two colors within each one of these leaves. You want to carefully remove your stencil and move that to the other portion of your card panel here. You can see that I had a little bit of trouble because I didn't want to smear the ink. If you smear the ink as you're moving this, your ink is going to end up in places that you don't necessarily want it to be. So I lined that back up, stuck that down with some Post-it note tape, and just did the same thing. Dropped in a little bit of that candied apple, then came in with the carved pumpkin and just blended that out just a little bit. So finally, I'm going to bring back in the autumn tree, the original stencil with the tree branches. And you can see on the bottom here that we have some piles of leaves that I wanted all along the base of my card panel. I am doing the same thing as I did with the individual leaves, using the candied apple, blending that out a little bit with the carved pumpkin. And this time I did bring in some fossilized amber just because I needed a little bit more of a variation because this is a larger area that I'm working with. You can see that I'm just using the same brush. So a lot of people also ask me if I have a brush for every single color. No, I don't. I don't think that's necessary. Number one, you can clean these brushes with just warm water. Number two, you can use them for the same color family. Sometimes you just have to kind of wipe them off on a scrap piece of paper or a paper towel, microfiber cloth, whatever you choose, whatever you have on your desk, and you're good to go to move on from an orange to a yellow or vice versa, however you want to do that. I don't recommend going from like a blue to a yellow because then, or a blue to an orange, because then you might get some mud. So once I have my entire card panel done here, and this is cut down to just a little bit smaller than my card base itself, I am going to take my card base, take my bone folder, and I have this at 8.5 by 4, and my card panel is just a little bit smaller. Going to go ahead and glue this down with my Tombow Mono multi glue. That way I have just a small white border on all 4 sides. And then I'm just going to take my die cuts here and kind of arrange them onto my card panel the way I plan on having them. So I want to make sure that I can fit all of my images and I don't have any blank space, because we've all done that. I think where you realize you need more images. I wanted my pumpkins, or 2 of my pumpkins anyway, to be coming out of this wagon, and then the other one I'll kind of just sit next to the deer. So once I'm happy with the placement, I am going to go ahead and take some foam tape and I'm going to stick this down to all of the images except for the 2 pumpkins that are coming out of the wagon. And this is also where I fixed some coloring mistakes, and I just take a white gel pen and go around that border where it was die cut. So I'm going to go ahead and pop these images up. I want my little squirrel to be inside the opening of this image here, and I'm really not sure what to call this, but I'm going to go ahead and pop him right there in the center. I popped up my little wagon, and then I will take my 2 pumpkins and stick them flat down with my wet glue inside of that wagon. Popped up the deer, the tree stump, as well as this other pumpkin here. Now I put too much foam tape on here, so I'm just going to take my scissors and snip off a little bit of that so that it isn't uneven, being that all my other images are popped up, and that way it'll fit snug right in between the deer. Next, moving on to my sentiment, I am going to take a piece of cardstock and I'm going to color it. You can certainly use colored cardstock here, but quite honestly, I just didn't want to cut a whole 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper for this teeny tiny sentiment. So I'm just using a Copic marker to make this cardstock whatever color I want it to be. I treated that with my anti-static tool, taking a sentiment from the Autumn Sentiment stamp set, stamped that out with Versamark ink, sprinkled on some white embossing powder, and then I went ahead and heat set that, making sure that my heat gun is heated up before bringing that to the paper. I cut this down into a pretty skinny little strip and then popped that up with some foam tape directly above my little images here. Last, I used a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen just to add some sparkle to the pumpkins and some other things, some random things. And that is it. That is the card for today, guys. As always, I will leave the supplies listed below. Have a great day. Bye.